Cuba has revealed that it has discovered a human trafficking network that operates from Russia, and recruits Cuban citizens to join the Russian military forces in the war in Ukraine. The Cuban Foreign Ministry said on Monday that it was working to neutralize and dismantle the network, which involved Cubans living in Russia and even some in Cuba. Ensure you stay well informed by subscribing to our channel, Slant News. We provide the latest, most credible news. Thank you for considering us. The news comes as a rare sign of tension between Cuba and Russia, two close allies that have strengthened their trade and political ties in recent years. Cuba has traditionally supported Russia's stance on the conflict in Ukraine, while Russia has offered to place arms in Cuba if talks with the West fail. The Cuban Foreign Ministry did not specify who was behind the operation, or how many Cubans had been involved. It also did not comment on whether any Cubans had joined the war in Ukraine as part of the trafficking ring, or whether the ring had any connections to the Russian government. However, a Russian regional newspaper, Ryazan Gazette, reported last May that several Cuban citizens had signed up with the Russian forces fighting in Ukraine, in exchange for a promise to receive Russian citizenship and payments. There have also been videos claiming to show Serbian volunteers training to fight alongside Russian troops in Ukraine. The Cuban Foreign Ministry said that Cuba had a firm and clear historical position against the use of mercenaries, and that it did not form part of the war in Ukraine. It said that it would act decisively against those who engaged in human trafficking with the aim of recruiting Cuban citizens to bear arms in any country. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez published the statement on X, formerly known as Twitter, adding that Cuba was using the force of the law to counter attempts to recruit its citizens. He also said that Cuba was committed to peace and dialogue, and that it rejected any interference or aggression against sovereign states. Experts say that the revelation of the human trafficking ring could strain the relations between Cuba and Russia, which have been close since the Soviet era. Cuba relies on Russia for economic and military support, especially after the US tightened its sanctions on the island under former President Donald Trump. Dr. Jorge Duaney, director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, told BBC News that Cuba's statement was surprising and unusual. He said that Cuba might have felt pressured to denounce the human trafficking ring after receiving information from its intelligence services, or from other sources. He also said that Cuba might have wanted to distance itself from Russia's involvement in the war in Ukraine, which has been condemned by most of the international community. He said that Cuba might have feared losing its credibility as a mediator and advocate for peace in other regions, such as Latin America and Africa. Dr. Mervyn Bain, a lecturer in international relations at the University of Aberdeen and an expert on Cuba-Russia relations, told The Guardian that Cuba's statement was a very rare moment of friction between the two countries. He said that Cuba might have been concerned about the potential impact of the human trafficking ring on its image and reputation. He also said that Cuba might have been worried about the safety and well-being of its citizens who were recruited by the network. He said that Cuba had a history of sending its troops abroad for humanitarian and ideological reasons, such as during the Cold War and more recently to fight Ebola in Africa. However, he said that Cuba had never sent its soldiers as mercenaries or for financial gain. The news of the human trafficking ring has also sparked reactions from other parties involved or affected by the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian government has not yet commented on the matter, but it has previously accused Russia of sending thousands of troops and mercenaries to support the pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. The US government has also not yet responded to the news, but it has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The US has imposed sanctions on Russia for its role in the war in Ukraine, and has provided military aid and training to Ukraine's armed forces. The European Union has also not yet issued a statement on the news, but it has been involved in diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. The EU has also imposed sanctions on Russia for its annexation of Crimea and its support for the separatists in eastern Ukraine. The war in Ukraine began in 2014, after a popular uprising ousted pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych and Russia annexed Crimea. Since then, more than 13,000 people have been killed and more than 1.5 million have been displaced by the fighting. A ceasefire agreement was signed in 2015, but it has been repeatedly violated by both sides. The war in Ukraine has also escalated tensions between Russia and the West, which have accused each other of interfering and provoking violence. In April this year, Russia amassed tens of thousands of troops near its border with Ukraine, raising fears of a major escalation. The situation has since de-escalated, but the risk of renewed hostilities remains high. The news of the human trafficking ring of Cubans to fight for Russia in Ukraine has added a new dimension to the complex and volatile situation in the region. It has also exposed a rare rift between Cuba and Russia, two allies that have been close for decades. It remains to be seen how the two countries will handle the issue, and what impact it will have on their relations and on the war in Ukraine.